Welcome to Sunday Sermons from Trinity UMC in Lincoln, a podcast to help on the faith journey. Now on to this week's message from Pastor Jeff Slater.
Did any of you watch the TV show West Wing back in the day? You know, I'm starting to feel old because I think West Wing has to include a back in the day at this point. It was a different time when West Wing was on, wasn't it? Now the show, if you don't know it, it's a show that was about a president of the United States and about the politics and kind of the inner workings of the White House. And they had some White House people advise about what life was like there. And it was a simpler time. I don't know that it felt that way, but it presented this vision of kind of what government could look like. Now, that's not to say it was perfect, and it also definitely had a political slant, so maybe you agreed with that, maybe you didn't, but it is at least one vision of how things ought to be, right? Okay, so maybe you watched West Wing. Did any of you watch the show House of Cards? I heard a couple of chuckles. That was a very different vision of what a president of the United States could be like. And in fact, it was a very dark one. You can even tell from the photography there just how dark it was with Kevin Spacey as the president. And it was about the lying and the cheating. It was about the power games that happen in politics. And I hope I'm not giving any huge spoilers here if I've made you want to go watch it. But the president even commits a murder early on in the show. It is dark. Let me just tell you, very different than the West Wing. And I remember at the time when House of Cards was first on, people were debating, well, which is it really like? Is that what Washington is really like? Is it really more like House of Cards, or is it more like the West Wing, like we'd want it to be? And the answer to that question seemed pretty clear, because there was a third show that was on television about then, Veep. And Veep, it was a comedy. It presented a much different view of it, with Julia Louis-Dreyfus as the one who becomes the president there. And it was about all these people who have no idea what they're doing. They're just bumbling around, hoping that something good happens, or hoping that something happens at all along the way. And it seemed like most people said, well, you know, real life in Washington is really less like the West Wing or House of Cards. It's really more like that, bumbling and flailing around. And I was thinking about this when kind of thinking about the theme for this year here at Trinity, because we've been reading the Christmas story this year from Matthew's Gospel. Now, I don't know if you've ever noticed, but when we do this Christmas Eve thing, every single one of the readings is from the Gospel of Luke. Well, except for the prophet in the Old Testament, but you know what I mean. All the Gospel readings are from Luke, and for good reason, because Luke tells a beautiful version of the Christmas story and a very true one. He tells the happiest and most wonderful parts of it. So, for instance, the angel visiting Mary, and Mary's a lovely response to the angel. She breaks out in song in Luke. And scholars actually believe that was a hymn from the early church that Luke put in there for Mary to say. And it's a beautiful version of the Christmas story. But every story has more than one side. And it's not as often that we talk about the Gospel of Matthew's telling of the Christmas story. And that's what I want to share with you tonight. So in Matthew's version, Mary is barely mentioned at all. And in fact, the story centers more on Joseph, in part because Joseph was the legal actor. Now, we talk about patriarchy. That might be a better save for another time, but it's how it was. And the story in Matthew is told from Joseph's point of view. And from his point of view, something terrible has happened, and he needs to do something. He's in a moral dilemma to try to figure out what to do. Now, he eventually gets visited by an angel and learns of what's about to happen too. But before that happens, all he knows is that this young woman that he's engaged to is pregnant, and she has this crazy story about an angel, and all Joseph knows for sure is that he's not the father. Now, you should know that in those days, the law was very strict and very specific, that if someone committed adultery, and if this happened during engagement, it was considered adultery by the law of the day, the penalty was death. The penalty was death by stoning. So from Joseph's point of view, he wants to save Mary. He wants to save Mary's life and the life of the baby, whatever's going on there. He doesn't really know yet. And so he decides he's going to break off the engagement because at least it would change things for her, and that she wouldn't have that, what would you call it, legal jeopardy. She wouldn't be in trouble. She wouldn't be, they wouldn't be able to hold her to the death penalty then. Now, Joseph then is visited by an angel too, and he realizes what's going on and knows that he has to stay with Mary, that there's something even bigger and something more important. But in the meantime, the Magi, we three kings and all that, they come to visit, and the Magi's role looks a lot more like Veep than anything else. Because the first thing the Magi do now, okay, pardon me here, because I guess I don't really know every custom of the day. But it seems to me like what the Magi do is the stupidest thing imaginable. So they see the star in the sky. These are kings or rulers or smart people and educated people from a distant land, and they see the signs and the stars, and they see that there is a new king that is born to the Jews. And so they travel to greet and to bring gifts and to pay homage to this new king. And so what's the first thing that they do? They go to Herod, the Roman who is overseeing the Jewish people, and, King Herod, and they go to King Herod and say, "Hey, King Herod, we heard there's a new, better king born. Do you know where he is? Would you send us to him?" Like, really? That's the angle you're going to play here, Magi? So now that was a Veep-like moment, but Herod's response is much more House of Cards. Herod's response, well, you can read this story in Matthew if you want. He leaves them for a minute. He goes to his advisors and basically checks the latest intelligence, and they confirmed, yes, there is rumbling that there's this star, or that something seems to have come to play here. And so Herod goes back to the Magi and says, "I don't know where he is, but if you find him, would you come and tell me so that I can take him a gift too?" He probably said it a little more slyly than that, but you get the idea, right? Herod is up to no good. He's trying to fool the Magi into telling him where this new king is so that Herod can take care of the business, right? Well, the Magi go off. They find the baby Jesus. As you know, they bring him the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And while they're there, it's clear that they had an experience. And I can only imagine what that experience must have been like to see the nativity, to see the baby Jesus, and to realize that a great turning point in God's history, in humanity's history, in the world had just happened, and that something had happened that was a lot bigger than Herod. The Magi realize what's going on, and they decide that they'll play a trick back on Herod. They'll deceive him, and they end up leaving through a different route so that they wouldn't be discovered, which also is known as running away, by the way, but I'm not going to hold it against him. When Herod finds out about it, he is livid. You talk about mad, you talk about angry. When Herod realizes that there is a king and that he's been deceived and doesn't know where to find it, Herod is not only mad, but he's worried too. And so what he does is something that, well, if you'll pardon me for pulling the punch, I kind of don't want to tell this part of the story in a family service. And I think some of you may figure it out, but he decides that the only way to take care of this new king that's been born is to make sure that any boy that's been born in the last 2 years, well, let's just say that to this day, in the church calendar on December 28th, we celebrate the Feast of the Holy Innocents in honor of what happened. This is not the version of the Christmas story we usually tell on Christmas Eve, is it? This is a much different version of the Christmas story, but the truth is, it's just as true as the one in Luke. It's just as true as the one that repeatedly breaks out into song. Now, with the exception of how dark it gets right there at the end with the holy innocents and all of that, there's part of this that doesn't sound so different, does it? I mean, we have these TV shows like West Wing and House of Cards and Veep and all that, and hearing this push and the back and forth and this play between Herod and the Magi and Joseph trying to do what's right and not knowing and all, like there's something about it that seems a little familiar, isn't there? That seems not so different than what we see in the world around us today. The difference of what happens in this story, though, in Matthew's telling of Jesus' birth, the difference is that Jesus is there to offer an alternative. Jesus is there to offer an alternative way to be. On the one side, there's the way of the world. And if we're honest, every one of us has made mistakes in our lives. Every one of us has made choices that we regret, that we wish we could go back and change. Every one of us has been a part of a larger system that's done things that we may not be proud of, and yet here we are, a part of something that we can't entirely control. And we know what it's like, the world of, well, in this story, we could call it the world of Herod in all of its imperfections and the ugliness that comes from. But at the same time, on the other side is Jesus and the gospel and the way that we know things ought to be. And just as every one of us has been a part of life that's less than right, so every one of us has had moments when we've made the right choices, when we've done the good thing, when we've fully lived into the way we were made to be, when we fully lived into the world of Jesus. Now, this story didn't start with Jesus, even if it did come to a new height then. You know, the ancients even further back called it the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve and taking the bite out of the apple and all that. It's the same thing, the choice that each of us has to make each moment of our lives. And it's tempting to draw this black and white kind of picture that on one side there's the world of Herod and on the other side the world of Jesus. But the truth is, most of us are more like Veep. Most of us are fumbling around in the middle, splashing, being drawn by currents in both directions, part of systems both good and bad, just trying to do our best to live our lives in between the two shores. That's where most of us live. And we try to live well, but the various forces pushing us each direction makes it so that we're not always sure what to do, like treading water in competing currents. What Christmas tells us, what that candle tells us, is that in the flailing middle is where we find Jesus. The story of Christmas is that in the middle of people trying to figure out how to live well, but being pulled between the forces of the world and the forces of God, that's precisely where we find Jesus, and it's precisely why Jesus came, to provide a light, to give us an example, to show us what life can be like, to inspire us, and to help us to hold that middle ground between the way the world, between the way heaven is, between the way the world of God is, and the way the world should be, so that we can be agents of change, so that we can be ones who help to bring the reality of Jesus and God into a world that desperately needs it. That's Christmas. And so here's what we need to do. You know, it's tempting to say we need to flee the things of the world and get as far away from them as possible and live like God and follow it, right? But you know what? I don't think that's the right answer. I think it's more like Jesus to say that our job is to stand with one foot in heaven and one foot on earth. Our job is to stand with one foot on the shore of everything that we see in Jesus that we know is right and good, and one foot in the world that desperately needs it, so that, like Jesus, we can help bridge the gap, so that we can be ones that help show the world what it can be, to help be that alternative of Jesus to the world, to help be the light shining in the darkness. And that means that when we watch the news, and when we see stories on the news that disturb us, that challenge us, when we see stories on the news and we think to ourselves, that's not how things should be, this isn't working the way it's supposed to work, we can be people that, well, A, are not necessarily surprised by it, because did you hear that thing about Herod earlier? But on the other side, we need to remember that we are people who walk in the way of Jesus, and we're here to be a light to a world that desperately needs it. And here's a place where we can do it. It means that when we scroll through our feeds on social media and we begin seeing thing after thing that drags us down, it means we pause and take a break and remember who we are so that when we go back to it, we can engage it as people who remember not only how things are, but how things should be, so that we can be a light. It means that when we get overwhelmed by the world around us, it means we take a deep breath. It means remembering who we are, so that when we go back into the world that's so overwhelming, we can do it knowing that we do not stand alone. So the first thing we need to do is to stand with one foot in each. The second thing, let your church support you. Because Jesus didn't just come alone. He didn't just come so that we could be Christians by ourselves. He came to form a community so that we wouldn't be alone, so that we could support one another, so that we could lift one another up, remind each other of what good is supposed to look like, and so that we could be the light together. But in all of it, I hope you revel in the simple gift of light, in the simple gift of Jesus, in the fact that God did come to give us something better. I hope you don't lose sight of it. This Christmas, may you see Jesus, the light that the darkness cannot overcome. Would you pray with me? Oh God, we thank you for the light, and we thank you for the better way to be, the better way to live that you've shown us in Jesus. Help us to revisit the story often. Help us always to seek you so that we might know your ways better and better. And God, help us when we engage our life in the world, troubled though it be. Help us to be people of the light. Help us to be people who take your light, carry it, and act as your presence to all we meet. We pray it in the name of the one in the manger. Amen.
Thanks for joining us for this week's Sunday sermon. For more information on growth groups or how to more fully embrace the life of faith, visit us at www.trinitylincoln.org.